Welcome to the Derek Diamond Experience podcast, where every week I take a look inside the world of film and television with those who have lived it and experienced it. I'm your host, Derek Diamond, and I've been excited for weeks about this chat because with the whole COVID-19 situation that we've been dealing with the last several months, it's made a lot of people realize that not just physical health, but mental health is super important. That's why I'm really excited to welcome to the show this week film producer and psychotherapist, Miss Rebecca Day. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And it's funny how this whole interview was set up because a couple of years ago, I went to Philadelphia for a conference called Podcast Movement. And it was there that I met a fellow podcaster and also a documentary filmmaker named Chris Parkhurst, who you were on his show fairly recently, and I listened to your episode, and I was like, I've got to get her on the podcast, because with this whole COVID situation, it being something that we've never dealt with before, mental health is really important, and it's something that I've really learned the last couple of years, not just with filmmaking, but things in my personal life as well. So I wanted to start off by asking you, which came first, the filmmaking side of your career or the therapist side of your career?
For me, the filmmaking side, definitely. I was working as a documentary producer for the last 12 years. I still am a little bit. I'm still producing a feature at the moment and a short, so I'm still doing a little bit, but I retrained as a psychotherapist about 3 or 4 years ago now. So yeah, that came much later.
What was it that initially made you want to get into filmmaking?
Oh, that's a good question. Nobody's asked me that for a really long time. I think when I was at school, I really wanted to be a journalist, actually. And I guess I wasn't really aware of documentary making so much at that point. I grew up in a very rural town in Scotland, and and then I just discovered I did a film course, and I mean, it wasn't documentary focused, but there was just something about it whenever we touched on it that I guess it was that interest in journalism and just people's stories that really intrigued me. And then, as I started doing work experience from leaving university, it was always the doc stuff that drew me, that really pulled me in. So yeah, it's just a kind of instinctual thing, I think.
Well, and it reminds me of a couple of things that I've been talking about recently here on the show, and that with documentary filmmaking, the truth can be sometimes a much better and sometimes even crazier story than a narrative or fiction. And in a way, the journalism and the documentary filmmaking are kind of one and the same. It's just a different form of storytelling. I mean, you're still finding out factual information and you're reporting it, but you're just doing it through a visual mean as opposed to, writing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something about the depth of documentary making. I know that, with journalism, you can go to that depth, but I think feature length documentaries, the amount of time that we spend with people and how immersed we are in the stories is really appealing to me. And then obviously the visual element of that as well, although hands up, I'm not a technical person in that sense. I've never directed anything. I always do the producing side.
So for those who may not know, what goes into the producing side of a documentary film?
For me, it's still a very creative role. So I work very closely with the director to shape the story and to just kind of figure out how we can tell that story in the most creative way possible. But really the producer, that's part of it, but it's a lot of strategy building as well. How are you going to get the film financed? Where are you then going to place the film when it's finished? And that's not just about distribution in terms of cinema and television. It's for me, the really exciting part of it is how you connect with the communities of people that will be interested in your story, the people that it really speaks to.
And I always like to bring that up because people will think of, like the director or the lead actor or actress when it comes to a film. Like, you see the creative side of it, but people don't think of the whole other side that it takes to to put a film together. Like, it's a true collaborative effort from all sides, from both the creative and the business side. So it's always interesting to hear the producer side of things, because I feel like that's something that's not really discussed when it comes to film, because, like I said, everyone wants to focus on, what you see. You see your acting, and people will bring up the screenwriting every now and then, but people rarely really bring up the business side. But it's very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess that's, you need the two things together. Obviously they complement each other, and I always worry when I hear that a director is going to try and produce a film alone, which often happens in documentary. And I guess it's partly because of the lack of funding, but it's also because those stories are so precious and so personal often that it can be really hard to hand it over to a producer. But it's a huge amount of work to balance the time needed to be creative, as well as the time needed to go to festivals and sell the film and be that voice that's selling the film as well, because often you're selling the idea as much as the director themselves. It's both of those things.
Well, and I don't know if you feel the same way, but what I love about the filmmaking process is what you just mentioned, that collaborative effort between all sides, creative, business, from director to producer, even all the way down to PA, is that a film, whether it's a narrative or a documentary, it takes a true collaborative effort in order to make it happen. I use this analogy, I feel like almost every other week here on the show, but a film is one giant machine, and all the roles are cogs in the machine, and it takes them all spinning and working together in order to make the machine work. Because if one doesn't, then the machine doesn't work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that takes a huge amount of communication, of course. And I think if we start to pull this around to mental health, that's often where we can fall short. Is just how we don't communicate the needs, what everybody's needs are in a project, And I think there's something quite unique about documentary in the way that it can take, some people can be working on their films for more than 3 years, directing them, shooting, developing, and a lot of that time is spent alone. They're very small teams, so the amount of time that you're actually filming a film that you might be taking a DOP with you or a sound recordist is actually quite small. And producers, I mean, I found I did work in a production office for some of my time producing, but I also worked from home as well. And you're behind a screen, predominantly looking at budgets and finance plans and all that kind of stuff. So it can be surprisingly isolating as well.
Well, also, and I wanted to really talk about this when it comes to the documentary side of things and how it deals with mental health, is that sometimes even the subject matter can have a huge effect on someone's mental health. I was talking with a documentary filmmaker on the show about a month ago. He actually went to Madagascar for an extended period of time, and they're one of the poorest countries in the entire world. And he talked about how seeing all these people, living in that environment really had an emotional impact on him. Is that something that you've seen now that you've also transitioned into the psychotherapist side of things? Is that something that you've seen during your time doing that?
Yes, definitely. I find myself talking about trauma a lot more than I thought I was going to be. And I haven't trained specifically in trauma, but that's part of my training plan over the next few months. Actually, my first course is in September, because it's something that just keeps coming up, this idea of either first-hand trauma or vicarious trauma. And when I use that word, it doesn't need to be a natural disaster or sort of childhood trauma that goes back a long way. They can be tiny moments that all build up, like a really difficult working relationship, or exactly like you just described of that documentary maker's experience in Madagascar. You're just being exposed to other people's suffering over a prolonged period of time, and we're not immune to those emotions. And we can only hold I think as human beings, we have an enormous capacity actually to hold that for other people, but not without acknowledging it and processing it and making space for it. And as filmmakers, that's something we're not very good at doing because we're very busy all of the time.
Yeah, because your mind's just thinking, okay, well, this is done. Now I've got to move on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. It's a huge in-depth process in really any aspect of filmmaking. But you hit the nail on the head. I think as human beings, emotions are very infectious, both positive and negative. Like if you're in a room and you see someone laugh, chances are it's going to make you laugh. If you see someone, say, crying, or you can tell they're upset, then usually the natural course is to feel empathy for that person. So I can't imagine going to another portion of the entire world and seeing just these vast amounts of people in these horrible situations. I personally, like, it would have, a huge traumatic effect on me. So I give major props to anyone who can do that. But at what point did you decide to go into the psychotherapist side of your career? Was there a specific moment that made you want to do that?
There was several. I think it was a combination of several moments or experiences, and it took me a long time. It wasn't a quick decision, so I was restless for probably around 3 years before I made the decision. Before I realised what it was that I wanted to do. I've been working on a film about a young man with motor neuron disease. You call it ALS in America. And I was working on the impact campaign for that film, and it was really transformative for me. I was the person who was in touch with the community of people who were living with this awful disease, or who were caring for people living with it. And when it was over, I really missed those conversations. I really missed that feeling of connection that I had with the people I was talking to, because what we essentially did is we organized a global screening campaign for the film. I was sort of the point of contact between hundreds of people who were getting in touch to organize screenings of this film all on the same day. So it's very intense and very emotional. And, we were dealing a lot with death and illness. But I was really surprised when it was finished. This huge void, it's like, oh, hang on, there was something about that was really potent for me, and it took me a while to find. I wasn't getting all of it in my documentary work, so the psychotherapy seemed to be a natural step. And then on the flip side, there was also my own experiences of burnout. I had a couple of episodes of burnout while I was working, and, just realizing that I didn't always have time for my friends and my family and my growing family as my sisters were having children, and knowing that I wanted to do that as well. And many things, just seeing other filmmakers struggle under the pressure and wondering where the support was. There were so many amazing filmmakers either leaving the industry or suffering from breakdowns, or, just being really stressed and not themselves, and realizing that there was nowhere for them to turn. Yeah. So many things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting because, with my job, we really preach work-life balance, because you have to have both. You can't totally immerse yourself in one thing, because if you focus only on your work, you're going to miss out on so many other opportunities. Like you mentioned, spending time with your family, your sisters having kids. I've kind of gone through the same thing with seeing close friends who are starting families or getting married. And it's like, I want to be a part of that and not immerse myself in, whether it's my day job, whether it's the filmmaking side of what I do, the podcasting side of what I do. You have to have that balance. Otherwise, you're going to get completely burned out. And like you said, it could result in, quitting whatever it is that you're doing, or it could be potentially worse.
Yeah. And we know it has been, there's a lot of research coming out at the moment and people talking as well about how systemic these problems are, especially in documentary, where we're seeing people really, really suffering, really struggling to the point of of not finding a way out and taking their own lives. And that's it has to be addressed. We have to be talking about it. So yeah, it's really crucial.
Well, and you mentioned the isolation part, because a lot of indie filmmakers, you have to wear a lot of hats. If it's a low budget or sometimes even a no budget film, if it's something that you're putting on yourself, some documentary filmmakers find themselves doing the filming, the editing, really all of it. And it can be a really emotionally draining process, because you got to think of the time you take to set up interviews, to go film footage, and then the editing. You're sitting by yourself in front of a computer for hours and hours and hours. It's a lot. It can really be a lot. People still don't realize how much work goes into even a short film.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that someone like you is addressing it.
Yeah, I mean, and it needs to come from. There's so many angles that need to be looked at, and I think as an industry we are slowly starting to do that. I mean, the way the decisions, what we allow ourselves as documentary makers is one thing, but there's also how the industry values documentary as an art form. And a lot of what you were just describing, often those are decisions made is because there's no other option financially. There's no other viable option to get in the team that you need to get your film made. So, sometimes it's a creative decision, and sometimes it's a decision of out of desperation. There's nowhere else to go. And I think, actually that really affects our creative capabilities as well, because when we're working at that high stress level, our capacity to be creative is quite reduced.
Well, and filmmakers often put a lot of pressure on themselves, because it is a high pressure environment, because you want to obviously put together the best project that you can. And as we've mentioned, there's a ton of work that goes into it. And if you try and do everything yourself, and that was something that I had to learn whenever I made my first film a couple of years ago, is that I had to delegate responsibilities, because I was wanting to do everything. Whereas, my assistant director told me, no, this person's here to do this job. You don't have to worry about it. And a lot of filmmakers don't have that person to tell them, no, you can take a step back. This person can handle it. You focus on the directing side of things, or focus on the camera side of things, or the writing side of things. Overloading yourself with trying to make it as good as you can, as we've mentioned, can often result in negative aspects. But I did want to ask you about, so you created this practice called Film in Mind in 2018. And we've mentioned, your past experiences and everything. And I think it's great that something like this exists, because a lot of people, they relate more to those who have been in the same situation as them, as far as troubling situations. Like you being on the filmmaking side of things, you know what it's like to be in that environment. So I think hearing advice from someone who has been there is extremely helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's been reflected back to me by a lot of my clients, is that they just don't need to explain the intricacies of how the industry works, or I think often it's actually justifying why we do what we do. Because when you start telling a stranger, or a therapist who starts off as a stranger, when you start telling them about that, actually it sounds completely bonkers. It's not you explain the stress, the sort of stress levels that puts onto your life, and how much time it's taking up, and how little money you're earning from it if you're not earning very much money, and all of those things combined. And they're like, well, why are you doing this? And that's not what filmmakers want to be doing, because it's such I guess it's quite an unspoken thing about why we're drawn to this type of work. You don't want to have to justify that in a therapy session. So I guess I spend a lot of time with filmmakers just sidestepping all of that preamble, and just getting straight down to what is it that your needs are in this moment, and how can we help you get there, or how can I help you get there. So a lot of confidence issues come up, and a lot of just like relationship struggles within the industry, and then realizing that, especially for documentary makers, a lot of that work that they're drawn towards is coming from a much deeper place than just curiosity as well. So there's a lot of that too.
You brought up an interesting point. If you go to just a standard therapist, it really is like you're telling a complete stranger your like most, I don't want to say intimate, but your most like personal problems. It is kind of a crazy concept, but yeah, it's interesting. You know, I'm glad that, you know, something like this is around because, as we've mentioned, filmmakers deal with so much pressure that is not really talked about. So to have that is, I think, a very valuable tool. So where can people go to find more information about Film in Mind?
I have a website, filminmind.co.uk. I couldn't get .com, unfortunately. I'm on Instagram as well, and I'm not very good with social media, but I try. And you can just email me. Yeah, it's rebecca@filminmind.co.uk. So I'm quite easy. I think all of my contact details are on the website, so I'm quite easy to find. And you know, it's an evolving practice. I mean, I started late 2018, and then I took a few months off for maternity leave, and so I really got going properly at the end of last year. And I'm really just responding to learning from my clients and figuring out, you know, finding out from them what they need, and then adapting the practice as I go along, and just kind of growing it that way, which is really rewarding. Yeah.
So is it just you that is offering advice? Do you have other people who are working with you?
I don't at the moment. No, it's just me.
Oh, fantastic.
I mean, the whole plan is to, you know, is to have a team of therapists, preferably in different parts of the world, so that you can actually do face to face. Because at the moment everything's over Zoom, partly because of the pandemic, but also because I live in a rural place in the north of England, so there's not many filmmakers here. But I really believe in choice of therapist as well, and so, you know, if somebody would prefer to talk to a man or would prefer to, you know, I think you just need to have a choice of the type of person that you want to talk to, because therapy only really works if you have the right fit for you. So that's the sort of long-term goal. Yeah, but it's finding those filmmakers who have then turned to therapy, or vice versa, you know, somebody with that understanding of the industry.
No, absolutely, and you hit the nail on the head, because I had a therapist years ago until, you know, she retired, but it was one of those things that I was only going to do it if it was the right fit, and luckily it turned out to be the right fit, because it's just like, you know, an inner circle of friends or a relationship. It has to be the right fit. You have to feel comfortable telling your most personal issues to that person, and if it doesn't connect, then, you know, you're not going to get, you know, out of it what you need. Yeah, so that's very important.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Yeah, you need to feel really safe in that relationship, and that you need to feel that you can trust them, and that they just understand you. And, you know, yeah, it's very much a personal thing.
Yeah. So we mentioned off and on COVID-19 and how the pandemic's been affecting everyone really since March, when things really started to get crazy. I know especially over here is when it started to get crazy. But how has COVID-19 affected you and your career?
Me personally, I feel very lucky. I have to say, I do feel very lucky in terms of the films I'm making. None of them were in filming at the time. So we can edit footage, and so that actually hasn't halted the development of those two films that I'm making at the moment. And then in terms of the Film in Mind work, I actually saw a big increase in clients coming my way, and I've been asked to, you know, I've been speaking on lots. There's been more panel discussions, more short workshops on mental health than I've ever seen before. So in many ways, I think what it's done is the industry has just kind of really halted in those first couple of months, and gave us all permission to pause and reflect, and part of what's come out of that is an understanding of how much we need to address mental health, because it's almost that there's been like a big sigh of, it's not relief, I don't know what it is, but it's, you know, it's like, okay, there's a bit of time, what am I going to do with this time? So yeah, it's been really busy for me, and I haven't had help with childcare, obviously, because the nurseries were all closed, so it's been a challenge, but it's been great.
Yeah, it's one of those things that, you know, the film industry completely stopped because almost everyone that I talked to was completely out of work. You know, actors are still doing, you know, virtual auditions and things like that. And you know, writers can obviously still write while still at home, but those who do the physical part of the filmmaking have been, you know, out of work, or projects they were working on have been completely halted. And it's been interesting to get everyone's take, because it's almost like everyone says kind of the same thing, but in a different way, and adds that little bit of a unique perspective. And I know with, you know, with my job, because I over here in the States, I work for a minor league baseball team that we have here in town, and baseball was canceled for us. You know, Major League Baseball is still going on, but minor league was canceled, you know, at the end of June. And we've had to adapt and do other things. And we've also been doing online workshops, and some of them have been on mental health. So in some ways it's bad, because it's almost sabotaged our normalcy. Like I'm one that I don't think what we knew as the norm will ever be that way again. Once, you know, the vaccines developed, and, you know, I mean, COVID will still be around, but I think it'll be something like the flu, whereas you just get, you know, a vaccine, or you get a shot for it, and you'll be fine at some point. But in a way, it's been a good learning opportunity, and as a way to learn other things. And I think learning about mental health has been one of those, because it's, in a way, I feel like almost force people to be more aware of it.
Yeah, yeah. I think it has. I think we've oddly, I think this sort of slowed down quite a bit, but there seemed to be this sort of frantic need to connect right at the very beginning. And a lot of that connection was actually people saying, how are you? Which I'm not sure we gave a lot of time to before. You know, it's like, how is all this affecting you? And people were being really honest. And it's, you know, when you bump into somebody at a film festival, you get asked about your project. You don't get asked about how you are. So that was a really big difference. I think I was quite surprised with the clients, especially my longer term clients who I've been seeing before the pandemic. We talked about it, and it was obviously very much part of our work, but it wasn't overwhelmingly so. You know, there was still all of those same issues that were there before was still existing, except there was more hope, maybe, that we actually could try and reframe things, reshape things, so that we don't go back as an industry to the way we worked before. So I think you're right when you say whatever that normal was before this happened, we won't go back to that.
No, and in some ways I think it's good, some ways it's not so good, but it's something that, you know, I think we'll all get through it in our own ways. Like we as the human race will get through it, and I think we'll embrace whatever the new normal will be. And you mentioned the, you know, asking how you're doing. I don't remember if it was from a movie or if it might have been something that I just heard in passing. But it's like you ask the question, how are you doing? And someone starts talking about their like career, or in this case, it might be their film project. And you're like, no, how are you doing? Mm-hmm. Not your project. How are you doing? So I think with things moving so fast before the pandemic, just the world in general moves so fast. And now that things have slowed down, it's made us realize a lot of things. Or I know at least it definitely has for me as far as mental health goes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it has. I guess it needs to be recognised how devastating it has been, and you know, for many individuals. And I guess the there's the reminder. I felt like I was saying this a lot at the very beginning and haven't said it for a little while, but just take it really slowly and be really gentle with yourself, because if you're struggling, then of course you're struggling. It's, you know, there's no need to feel like you need to be on top of it all and fixing it all straight away. I mean, it's just such an enormous shift, such a huge amount to kind of grapple with that. Yeah, it's going to take a while to figure out, I guess, and it's not just the individual's responsibility. If we bring it back around to industry, I mean, it's very much, you know, a collective responsibility.
I am very interested to see what the new norm will be for film, because you think of how many people are on a set. You know, just even on a short film, there's still, you know, at least 8 to 10 people on set. It makes me wonder if we've seen not necessarily the last of the big budget blockbuster movies like your Marvel movies or your Star Wars movies, but I wonder if we'll just see less of them and we'll see your more like smaller scale independent type film.
Yes, perhaps. Yeah.
It's,
I know, it would really change things, wouldn't it?
yeah,
Yeah.
it's going to be very interesting. It's going to affect everything from, I think, how films are made all the way down to movie theaters, because over here, all the major theaters are still closed. You know, AMC and Regal are all still closed. So I think they could open, I think, as soon as the end of the month, but they also said that 2 months ago, and they just keep pushing everything back. So I've said, you know, in conversations both on and off the show, that I think we're going to see the return of the smaller scale, like locally owned theaters that will show your smaller independent movies, which I'm perfectly okay with, because to me, those, for the most part, have the better story. And I love, you know, the Marvel franchise and the Star Wars franchises, but I think we'll see a lot more of your smaller independent movies.
Yeah, I would love to see that, and not just because of the quality of the films that you'll then get in, but also because of the community that creates. You know, in small towns or villages, these sort of community screenings are really special. As a documentary maker, that's often, you know, the types of films that I've worked on, that's often where the screenings are the most popular. You know, we can do a theatrical release because that's kind of what's expected, but you have very small audiences, and then you do a community screening and you could have full audiences in all of those, and they're in village halls and, you know, all sorts of unusual places. And then there's always a Q&A afterwards and people talking, and it's such a wonderful way to bring people together. So I think that will be very much needed. Yeah.
No, I love stuff like that. Back in December, actually, we have a really strong film community here in Pensacola. And in December, we had almost like a mini film festival where we showed 6 different shorts that were made in the Gulf Coast area, you know, like in Florida and somewhere, I think, made in Alabama and in Mississippi. But it was the weekend before Christmas, and it had been pouring rain all day. It rained from 8 o'clock in the morning until, you know, after the event was over. But we still had between 60 and 70 people show up, which was still, I think, really good. But I like you said, in doing Q&As afterwards, I love festivals and screenings like that. So I do think we'll definitely get more. At least I hope so.
Yeah, or more outdoor screenings. Maybe
Yeah.
that's the way to go. Not so popular in Scotland or the north of England, but we can try. We'll bring some umbrellas.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and yeah, outdoor could be a thing too with COVID, because that seems to be that. I think that will probably be part of the new norm, is more outdoor things like screenings, concerts, things like that. I think we'll see a lot more of those. But as we start to wrap up here, you had mentioned that you had some films that you were working on that had already been filmed, so that didn't really, you know, they weren't really affected by COVID. What do you have, you know, in the works currently?
So I have a short film that's almost finished, and a feature film that we've still got a bit of filming to do, but we've done quite a bit of it. That's a mental health film. Actually, well, I say it's a mental health film. It's around those themes. So it's a personal film from the director, so Scottish filmmaker Duncan Cowles that I'm working with, and it's about men's mental health. So we're looking at he's looking at his own struggle with intimacy and emotion, and he goes on a bit of a road trip around the UK talking to other men about why that is such a struggle. So yeah, I think there's similar themes in the short film as well, but it's also looking at the short film is set in the Lake District where I live now, so it's very much about our connection with the land and nature. So yeah, they're all thematically very linked to who I am, for sure.
I would love to see that documentary about men's mental health, because that's something that is, I feel like, starting to get talked about more. At least over here it is. But, it's like men still have that stigma of, you can't talk about your emotions or talk about your feelings. So I would love to see that whenever it's done.
Yeah, it certainly seems to connect with lots of people whenever we talk about it. And, I think people can feel it, and whatever their experience is with it, it's certainly a pretty systemic problem in Western society, at least. So, yeah, well, hopefully we'll get that finished next year. It's called Silent Men at the moment.
Absolutely. No, I would love to see it. What's one piece of advice that you could offer to an aspiring filmmaker?
It's a good question. I've spoken to a lot of new emerging filmmakers who feel like they're being asked to do things that make them feel uncomfortable, that maybe feels exploitative, I guess. And I think in the very early stages of your career, it's really hard to set those boundaries and turn around and say, no, I'm not going to do that. And I think for emerging filmmakers, it is about asking yourself what kind of workplace you want to be in, what kind of films you want to make, how do you want your working life to look? And you set that up at the very beginning, and hopefully that's as healthy, as positive as it can be. And there is such a fear of losing jobs. It's so hard. But until we start doing that, it feels like things are going to be much harder to change. So I guess that's it. And set up a support network. Definitely, just make that part of our industry practice. I think it needs to be standard practice for doc makers to be having this kind of talking support, reflective, whether that's with a therapist or your own reflective time. I think that feels essential. And I am encouraging, the funders will come around to this, but I think we just need to start including it in our budgets as well. If you need therapeutic support, put a line in your budget. You shouldn't have to don't have to justify that to your funder. It's self-explanatory, really. So yeah, that's another piece of advice, I think.
Hopefully that becomes part of this new norm that we've been talking about.
Yeah. Yes, I hope so.
And finally, remind everyone of your website and social media so the listeners can check you out.
So the website is filminmind.co.uk, and Instagram is at film.in.mind, I think I managed to get. And then Facebook is at filminmind as well. And my email is just rebecca@filminmind.co.uk. So it's all, yeah, you can find me. I think that's all on the website. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. This was a really fun and informative chat. So thank you again. This was great.
Well, thank you for having me, Derek, and thanks for your insightful questions. Yeah. And I hope the next wee while pans out well for you and well for everyone else, and just look after each other, and yeah.